No Sabo Kids. How did it happen? How is it that there are millions of Latinos in the US who cannot speak Spanish? Technically, I'm a No Sabo kid and fit into those millions of Latinos. But I say technically porque sí hablo español. Pero no lo hablo bien, ¿sabes? To find the reason as to why Latinos stopped speaking Spanish here in the US, we have to go back to the 1800s. From the moment states like California, Arizona, New Mexico, basically the entire western states became a part of the US, there has been discrimination against the Mexicans. When the Treaty of Guadalupe was signed by the US, they agreed essentially that the Mexicans that stayed in the US would, one, be considered US citizens, but two, also be able to hold on to their lands. Just a couple years later after the treaty was signed, states like California would rewrite their land laws. They would force Mexican landowners to reclaim their lands in court, which ended up being a really long process, and the end result of that was that the Mexican landowners had to sell their lands in order to pay for the court fees that they had accrued. The political landscape in Mexico during the early 1900s drove Mexicans north, which made US employers happy because now they had a cheap labor workforce. But just because the employers were happy to have them, most European Americans were not happy about it at all. Mexicans were banned from white establishments. They were lynched, they segregated, and not just in neighborhoods but in schools. Anyone who spoke Spanish was thought of as an uneducated and lazy person. But that didn't apply to the Spanish because they looked white. Thousands of Latinos were killed by mob violence. The Great Depression brought even more hate from the European Americans. They accused Mexicans of stealing jobs. Interesting that even now, almost 100 years later, that is still a sentiment within a certain demographic of people. About 2 million Latinos were forcibly deported to Mexico during this time period. 60% of them were US citizens. So when a particular group of Latinos who support a certain guy think that it won't happen to them, it absolutely will. Because it still happens even today. Anyone who looked Mexican was deported to Mexico even if they weren't, which forced a lot of white passing Mexicans to say that they were from Spain. That level of discrimination forced Spanish speakers to stop speaking Spanish and to stop teaching Spanish to their kids. Even in more recent times, some parents work so hard to learn English that they just forget teaching Spanish to their kids, because that discrimination still exists. I even remember a tia of mine who had been in California for a long time telling my family to not teach us Spanish, that it had to be English. A lot of parents didn't teach their kids Spanish because they didn't want them to experience that same discrimination that they had. Us No Sabo kids have been around for a very long time. It is nothing new. And just a reminder, you are Latino enough.